In a small coastal town in Scotland, where mornings smelled of salt and old stone buildings remembered more than people did, lived a man named Edward Miller. Edward was not poor, and he was not rich either, but more than anything, he was invisible. For nearly 30 years, Edward worked at the same shipping warehouse near the docks. Every morning at 5:30 a.m., he walked the same narrow street, unlocked the same side door, and stood at the same loading station. He never arrived late, never complained, and never argued. When shipments were delayed, Edward stayed late. When coworkers made mistakes, Edward fixed them quietly. When younger men were promoted ahead of him, Edward nodded and said nothing. People liked Edward because he was easy, and over time, being easy became the reason he was overlooked. At home, his life followed the same pattern. His wife, Margaret, was practical and tired. She had learned that Edward would always adjust, always bend, and always give in. Decisions were made without him. Conversations happened over his silence, and even his own children, now grown and living far away, rarely called. Not because they didn't love him, but because Edward never demanded space in their lives. He had taught the world one lesson very well, that he could be overlooked without protest. One winter evening, the warehouse manager announced a major restructuring. Jobs would be reassigned, and some roles would disappear. Edward listened quietly as names were read out, and when his name was not called, he felt a brief moment of relief. Then the manager added that Edward would need to train the new supervisors and asked him to be patient because they were young. Edward understood immediately what that meant. More responsibility, longer hours, no extra pay, and no title. He opened his mouth, hesitated, then closed it again and simply said, "Yes." That night, Edward walked home under freezing rain. And for the first time in years, something inside him felt unbearably heavy. It wasn't anger or sadness, but exhaustion, the kind that settles deep inside a person who has carried too much without ever setting it down. Weeks passed, and Edward trained men half his age who interrupted him, corrected him, and dismissed his experience. One of them laughed one afternoon and asked why Edward had never moved up, despite being there for so long. Edward smiled weakly because he didn't know how to explain that silence had become his identity. One morning, Edward collapsed at work. It wasn't dramatic, and there were no warning signs that anyone noticed. His body simply gave in after years of carrying what his voice never had. At the hospital, the doctor told him it was stress, years of it, and reminded him that suppressed stress was still stress. Margaret sat beside his bed, shaken, and told him she hadn't realized it was that bad. Edward wanted to say that he had tried to tell her, but the truth was that he never truly had. A week later, Edward returned to work, slower and paler, but clearer than before. When the manager asked him to stay late again, Edward felt the familiar pressure rise inside him, the same pressure he had always pushed down. This time, he didn't. He quietly said that he couldn't. And when the manager looked confused, Edward repeated that he wouldn't continue training supervisors without proper compensation. The room fell silent, his heart pounded, and his hands trembled. But for the first time in a long while, he felt present. They talked after that, and while Edward didn't receive everything he deserved, he received something new, a formal role, defined hours, and respect that came not from kindness, but from boundaries. At home, Edward began speaking too, slowly and awkwardly, but honestly. When Margaret interrupted him, he gently asked her to let him finish, and though she looked surprised, she listened. Months later, Edward received a call from his son, who admitted that he had realized how distant he had been, and that he had always assumed his father was fine. Edward told him quietly that he hadn't been, and that he should have said so sooner. Edward didn't become rich, famous, or powerful, but he learned something that many people realize too late. Silence does not make a person strong. It only teaches the world how to ignore them, and sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is speak honestly, for their body is forced to speak for them.